Asserting central dominion, this pawn immediately claims vital space and prepares rapid piece development. Establishing central presence immediately, 1. d5 contests the space white claimed with 1d4, preparing a solid foundation for piece development. Challenging the central pawn's dominion, this thrust immediately ignites a struggle for space and initiative, potentially opening lines of attack. Accepting the pawn presents an immediate pawn majority in the center for black, inviting aggressive piece development. Developing the knight to control central squares and prepare kingside castling, the queen's gambit accepted is challenged by this proactive piece placement. Preventing white's eventual b4 pawn push, a solid prophylactic measure that also prepares for queenside expansion. Securing the pawn and preparing for bishop development, this solidifies white's center. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal often pressures white's central control and prepares for castling. Recapturing the pawn solidifies white's center and prepares rapid development towards the kingside. Solidifying the pawn structure and preparing for a queenside expansion, this move aims to unpin the knight and regain central influence. Unleashing the queen towards the queenside aggressively pressures black's pawn structure, potentially forcing concessions. Sacrificing the bishop here creates a dynamic imbalance, potentially opening diagonals and exposing white's king. Opening the g-file dramatically assaults the black king's safety, creating dynamic imbalances. Gaining queenside space, black aims to untangle their pieces. Safeguarding the central pawn advances while preparing a kingside castling. This move subtly bolsters white's development. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies the center and prepares for potential pawn advances, adding flexibility to black's setup. Asserting space on the queenside, this pawn advance pressures black's vulnerable queenside structure. This advance boldly expands black's queenside space, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and prepare further counterplay. Asserting central control and preparing queenside expansion, a solid foundation for future operations. Developing the knight to f6 reinforces the central structure and prepares for potential queenside castling, while offering support against white's ambitious queenside pawn push. Unleashing a knight to the central square, white seizes initiative, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the open lines. Challenging the center with c5, seizes the initiative, creating pawn dynamics and potential for piece activity. Disrupting black's pawn structure, this exchange seizes central control and initiates piece activity. Reclaiming the piece with the queen immediately activates it, eyeing central squares and challenging white's central pawn structure while keeping the king relatively safe for now. Opening a central avenue, this pawn push directly confronts black's queen and seeks to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure after the capture on f3. Fortifying the pawn chain, black boldly accepts the central challenge, aiming to secure vital queenside space. Pushing the pawn here aggressively stakes a claim on the queenside, restricting black's pieces and creating potential weaknesses down the line. Developing the bishop to d6 fortifies the kingside and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Opening the e-file for the rook creates immediate attacking chances and pins the knight, forcing a decision. Securing the monarch heralds a shift towards defensive consolidation, preparing for potential central pawn advances by the opponent. Preparing to seize the d-file, white aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and gain a crucial open avenue. Challenging white's queenside pawn chain with an immediate pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and create play on the queenside. Capturing the pawn opens the queen to the center, challenging black's queen and creating immediate dynamic threats. Asserting control over the crucial d-file opens up avenues for the rook to infiltrate white's queenside, potentially disrupting their pawn structure. This queen repositioning creates dangerous pressure on the c-file and eye on the weakened queenside pawns. Unleashing the queen to c4's diagonal, black's objective appears to be a swift dismantling of white's central pawn structure before launching an attack. Shifting the king forward unlocks diagonal lines, and prepares for an active role in the impending skirmish. Igniting a central pawn storm now throws a calculated challenge at white's pawn chain and potentially exposes the king. Unleashing the rook to pressure the g-file, forcing black to confront the creeping centralization of white's pieces. Unleashing the queen aggressively, black hopes to disrupt white's d-file control and create attacking chances against the uncastled king. Repositioning the rook aims to fortify the kingside and prepare for potential central breakthroughs, while keeping the 7th rank under surveillance. Unleashing the knight opens crucial central diagonals, threatening the pinned e-pawn and creating a dynamic attacking force. Repositioning the queen from its active square, white seeks to better defend the kingside and potentially support a central pawn push. Shifting the queen aggressively towards the king's side, black aims to exploit potential weaknesses and create mating threats. Shifting the monarch is a defensive maneuver, acknowledging the mounting pressure along the central files. Challenging the king's shelter with a pawn thrust, black injects a dose of chaos into white's seemingly secure position. Fortifying the bishop's outpost, this bishop offers crucial defense and potential for future pawn advances. Seeking central control, black aims to unblock the queenside and generate play against white's potentially exposed monarch. Securing the king's retreat pathway is paramount, as the initiative shifts to black's queenside pressure. Initiating a rook lift to pressure the weakened kingside. Repositioning the bishop to c4 bolsters, the pawn chains defense and prepares for potential kingside expansion. Sensing a lack of central control, black initiates a crucial pawn advance to seize initiative. Shifting the queen away from the kingside allows black to seize the open files for their rooks. Shielding the king and preparing for potential central pawn breaks by reinforcing the bishop's defensive duties. Rescuing the rook from the back rank, this maneuver aims to prevent further weakening of the pawn structure while seeking active counterplay. Shifting attention to the queen side could be a better strategy than this immediate queen repositioning. Seeking to consolidate the queenside pressure, white repositions the queen to a more active square. Shifting the queen to f7 aims to support the f-pawn's advance and potentially coordinate with other pieces along the 7th rank. Busting open this queenside pawn chain seems like a hopeful gambit, but it might just weaken white's king position. A necessary repositioning, the king seeks refuge from the encroaching enemy pawns on the queenside. Reoccupying the open file with the rook aims to disrupt black's queenside pressure and create attacking potential. Activating the rook on the semi-open file is a bold gambit, hoping to disrupt white's compact setup and create counterplay. Unlocking the c-file demands vigilance as the bishop retreats, preparing for potential pressure. Navigating the queenside entanglement, this knight repositions to a more central outpost, eyeing potential breaks and supporting the beleaguered king. Opening the bishop's diagonal here aims to create threats against black's king, forcing a defensive reaction. Unveiling the long-lost dark-squared bishop, this maneuver aims to activate the rook on the e-file and potentially unpin the knight. Shifting queen to reinforce the d-file, creating options for central pressure. A subtle repositioning, seeking greater influence over the center and preparing for potential pawn pushes while white's pieces remain somewhat passive. Unlocking the kingside attack, white repositions the queen to directly support a potential kingside advance and coordinate with the other pieces. Reorganizing the queen's patrol to survey the queenside flank feels prudent, considering the current pawn structure. A calculated risk to seize the open g-file, inviting immediate counterplay or a strategic retreat by black's queen. Creating a defensive wall is essential, as the g6 pawn fortifies the king's sanctuary. Reaffirming the queen's central influence aims to break black's solid setup, seeking active counterplay. Unleashing the bishop offers crucial defensive support, stabilizing the kingside by covering the e5 pawn and preparing for potential counterplay. Recapturing the bishop on c1, white aims to redeploy the piece more actively, potentially eyeing the queenside or preparing a more cohesive structure. Shifting the bishop, there aims to support the d-pawn's potential advance and prepare for a kingside pawn storm. Repositioning the rook defensively to guard the 6th rank effectively anticipates potential queenside advances and solidifies white's structure. Activating the bishop here on e7 aims to develop a piece that's been passive and prepare for potential future activity on the kingside. Shifting bishop activity to a more imposing diagonal, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses on the queenside. Liberating the knight allows it to seek out better squares, perhaps on e4, to challenge white's central pawn structure. Recentering the rook here seeks to improve its defensive posture on the 2nd rank, preparing for potential pawn pushes or future king safety maneuvers. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank aims to challenge white's king and potentially disrupt their defensive structure. Capturing the pawn opens lines but abandons king safety. Unleashing the rook to the 7th rank immediately intensifies pressure along the open file, challenging white's defensive structure. Pushing the bishop forward targets black's compromised queenside pawn structure and prepares to exploit the open lines. A desperate attempt to find counterplay, but it leaves the rook exposed on an open file. Pushing the pawn here aims to restrict black's rooks and potentially open a path for the king. Unleashing a pawn storm, black aims to disrupt the queenside structure and create complications around white's king. Sensing black's king is exposed, white aims to use the queen for a swift kingside attack. Developing the bishop to d6 shores up potential weaknesses and prepares for a flexible regrouping of black's forces. Repositioning the queen seeks to contest the now open g-file and support a potential pawn advance. Repositioning the rook to the g-file aims to support the pawn storm and increase pressure on white's queenside. Repositioning the queen aims to disrupt black's potentially coordinated attack and free up other pieces for defensive duties. Shifting the queen's gaze back to the kingside hints at a latent threat, perhaps preparing a future assault. Shifting the bishop to guard the critical diagonal suddenly offers a subtle but effective defensive shield. Unleashing potential attacking energy, black aims to crack open white's king defenses by opening aggressive pawn lines. Fortifying the bishop on e1 solidifies the queenside and prepares for potential pawn advances down the center. Creating a fortress for the king by building a protective pawn wall seems to be the primary intention here, despite the material deficit. Opening the f-file with this capture dramatically alters the pawn structure, potentially creating attacking chances for white's rook. Opening the g-file with this capture unleashes attacking potential against white's vulnerable king. Unleashing the bishop finally opens attacking avenues towards black's vulnerable king. Seizing the open file, black forces a decisive exchange that drastically simplifies the position towards a favorable endgame. Sacrificing material here opens up attacking avenues against black's exposed king. Sacrificing the rook to open a diagonal for the bishop creates an interesting counterplay scenario. Exploiting the exposed king, white sacrifices material to shatter the black defensive structure and initiate a decisive attack. The stark capture on g1 forces an immediate exchange, ushering in an endgame where pawn structure will dictate the outcome. Queens now dominate the board as the rooks are exchanged, paving the way for potential mating attacks. The rooks finally exchange, transitioning the game to a decisive material imbalance where the single passed pawn becomes a significant factor. Exposing the king prematurely after the trade opens a dangerous path for black's remaining pieces. The knight's repositioning aims to contest the d-file and prepare a more active role in the ensuing exchanges. Unleashing the pawn's final charge, creating an unstoppable passed threat that will demand constant attention and likely win the game. Attempting to activate the knight offers a glimmer of counterplay, but may prove too slow given white's overwhelming pawn advantage. Relocating the king towards the center is paramount as the board simplifies, preparing for the inevitable pawn race in the endgame. King activation begins now, aiming to join the final skirmish on the queen side. Securing the king behind pawns, White prepares for the inevitable pawn race to promotion. This maneuver aims to activate the king, repositioning it for potential pawn support in the impending endgame. Shifting the bishop to B2 aims to redeploy it for improved diagonal pressure or defensive coverage, subtly repositioning for the next phase of the game. Shifting the king to the center is crucial for future endgame maneuvering. The king finally ventures out, seeking shelter on the queenside as the pawn storm appears to be losing steam. Centralizing the king is a sensible endgame goal, aiming to support the remaining pieces and counter White's advancing pawn. Shifting the king toward the center consolidates its defensive posture and prepares for active participation in the endgame.